Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today, Nastia is leading us through the perilous underbelly of contaminations in our food supply.
Dun, dun, dun.
And she's taking us through some really interesting databases with respect to plastic molecular contamination, particularly plastics that are hormone mimetics, hormone disruptors, things that have known health consequences. And they seem to be appearing in almost all of our foods, and there's no real rhyme or reason to it. So we're trying to make sense of it. We're trying to ultimately answer the question, does it matter whether we get these plastics? I mean, are they really at concentrations that are going to damage us in the long run? And there's some nuance to that. By the way, what do we do about it? And so we're working all that out today.
If you like what we do, consider supporting the podcast. There are a bunch of different ways in which you can do it. The first and foremost is that you can like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening on a podcast store, leave a review. Follow us on the platform. It helps us with the algorithm immensely because they like things that keep people on the platform. And so if you engage directly with us there,
push the button.
It means that the platforms will push us. And everybody benefits because we get to make better podcasts if we're bigger, and you guys get to listen to better guests if we're bigger. If you want to support us even more, you should consider coming to our conference in Portugal. So we have talked a lot about paradigm shifts in science. We have talked a lot about the fact that the world of science is about to change. We spend all of our time here collecting theories about the future of science. And this summer, we're actually going to do something about it.
Yeah, I think we're putting together an actual historic conference this summer, and you don't want to miss it if you can afford to be there. We are bringing together some of the greatest critics of standard cosmology in our time, along with proponents of a new cosmology and apologists for the old cosmology who are dead set that they can repair the theory in spite of the new data coming out of the James Webb. So this is going to be an absolute riot. And we're putting all these people together for panels over the course of 3 or 4 days in June of this summer. And you don't want to miss this.
We're going to have everybody from Big Bangers to plasma cosmologists to liquid sun to tired light to electric universe.
Plus the Lambda CDM people. That's what's really unique and amazing about this is you got everybody in the world you can imagine with different ideas about cosmology with all the people who are promoting the standard cosmology. It's perfect.
And we're doing it at a super nice venue in Portugal. It's a seaside hotel. Every single room in the hotel has an ocean view. And so come for the weekend. Bring your partner. There's enough space for everybody. It's going to be a really fantastic weekend. And if our last conference is any indication, it's going to just be a really, really social and exciting time for everybody who attends.
Bring all your partners. Bring your family. Bring your kids. Yeah, bring grandma. Everybody's going to love it.
Just make like a European vacation out of it because I promise you, you will not regret it. And there's tons for them to do while you come to talks and panels and everything else.
Everybody loves cosmology. Grandma would love it.
Grandma loves cosmology, indeed. We have a Patreon. If you want to sign up for the Patreon, that is also fantastic. Patreon.com/demystifysci. If you sign up, you get a discount on conference membership. And so that is to entice you. You also get to join our fantastic Sunday salon where we get together with listeners and we talk about all of the things that they're most curious about. Sometimes we have guests come by for little like Q&A sessions. Not that often. We've only done that once. But if this is enticing, we will do it more often.
Last thing to plug before we get into the meat of this, we got new t-shirt designs. We just put out a bunch of really cool black and white punk rock t-shirts, so grab one. And you can support the podcast and rock some really cool designs.
And for now, enjoy the conversation. I have a lot of things to say about plastics. Shiloh mostly acts as my soundboard. And next time, I will be Shiloh's soundboard as we discuss the endless grift in science.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DSPod SOLO podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I'm going to start recording.
We definitely probably want to tell people stuff though, because a lot of them are.
Yeah. I'm not like. Yeah. Okay.
You've taken a lot onto yourself with this, by the way.
In what sense?
You've done all the work for this podcast.
I
I'm
mean,
just
I haven't done
the
that much
passenger.
work. I've just been kind of like,
How did this get started?
how did this get started? So I spend a lot of time on Twitter. I don't know if you know this or not.
I know that for sure.
And there's a guy on Twitter who I follow. His name's Nat
I
Friedman.
want my wife back.
What do you mean? I don't spend that much time on Twitter.
So, didn't you get in a fight with your little brother about whether or not microplastics were actually dangerous? Isn't that the sort of overall lead with the thesis of this project situation?
Okay, so Alyosha and I had a really interesting conversation where I was trying to make the case that things produced by industrial society deserve to be treated as questionably safe until proven otherwise. And specifically, I was looking, the conversation that he and I had at first.
Wait, which one of you thought they were questionably safe until proven otherwise? So your brother thinks they're questionably not safe until proven otherwise? What is the, sorry, I don't understand the positions yet.
The position is that he's basically like, everything is fine.
Mm.
Cell phones are fine, like blue light is fine, plastics are fine, everything is fine.
And do you take the opposite position that everything's dangerous until proven otherwise?
That makes me sound very paranoid, but ostensibly, I think that things that the products of industrial society should be treated with skepticism until they have been proven to be unquestionably safe. Like I use the example of, okay, so when we discovered radioactivity,
Except for the products made by our sponsors. Sorry,
Coca-Cola and Pfizer. So like, okay, we discover radioactivity and x-rays. And what happens? We put devices inside of shoe stores where you can put your foot into it and you can wiggle it around and get a real-time x-ray. And
I
then
really
later,
miss those.
I didn't think you were that old. You look really good, if that's the case.
It's the beard. Covers up the aging process.
And it's nicely colored too.
Wicked
maintained.
aging below the beard, actually.
It's all age spots and liver spots.
Yeah, so these things show up in the market, and everybody's like,
Yeah,
it's cool.
it's amazing.
Yeah, okay.
Because like the shoe store salesmen are like, fantastic, we can sell you more shoes because we have this thing that draws you into the store. And then later we're like, oh shit, that causes cancer. Same thing with like radium. Radium was really popular because you could paint like watch dials with it. The watch dials would glow in the dark, very convenient. But then all of the girls at the factory that would paint the watch dials ended up getting cancer of the face because they would lick the brushes while painting and eat the radium paint. And then it's
What could go wrong?
at the time, if you subscribe to the fact that everything is cool, nothing. But then you discover later that, oh shit, there's all these things that are in the environment that are taken for granted that probably aren't that good for you.
And this seems to be the case with technology after technology for the most part, right? So all these, even flying in airplanes too much can give you cancer, it seems like. I mean, what else? Birth control, just all sorts of interventions, right? Even antibiotics, right? Turn out to come with a whole host of side effects that people weren't anticipating in terms of resistance and so forth.
Well, and also like some of them make you go blind and they ruin your kidneys and they damage your organs. I'm staring off into the distance because I'm trying to think of technologies that seem to be like pretty good. Where I'm like, houseplants? These are all like domesticated.
Is that a
freak
technology?
shows. Well, I mean, they're like domesticated freak shows, right? Like they're not, you can't go into the wild and find any of these plants. They're like bred, as far as I understand, to be for home use. So that's a technology. It's not a technology where you're like imbibing it, but I think that like plant breeding in general is one of those things. Plant breeding, when taken to its extreme, is like Roundup ready corn that then gets like cooked into tortilla chips. And that's you've veered off from just, hey, we've domesticated things to everything is fine now. Domesticated animals, probably good too. Trains feel good.
Brake dust.
Yeah, but like it's confined and
Those New York City subways. Good Lord.
but I'm thinking like long distance surface trains.
But I'll go with it. Like, there's reason to be skeptical and to look at these technologies as they come online as if they're not these perfect, completely harmless entities.
And I just like, I think that it's I don't want to treat this as a Luddite, where I'm like, all technology is bad, we should destroy it. All technology is bad, we should destroy it, we should return to the Stone Age. Like, I've met people who are like, humanity made a mistake the first time that we domesticated grain and animals. And were we still hunter-gatherers, the world would be a much better, richer place. And I'm like...
Depends what you value, ultimately.
Yeah, like, none of the work that we do would be possible if we were hunter-gatherers, right? So, okay. The entire products of intellectual society wouldn't be possible if we were hunter-gatherers.
But we can roll this back to the plastic world we live in at this point for the conversation today.
Yeah, so like when we were talking with Alyosha, I was expressing skepticism about cell phones because he carries 2 cell phones.
I think this is actually on the list of things we can't talk about on YouTube. Just so you know.
He carries 2 objects.
That's totally fine.
That emit.
Hey, YouTube, we are totally fine with carrying 2 cell phones. Whatever Nancy is saying, that she doesn't mean
cell
it.
Cell phones are fantastic.
They're fantastic.
Sponsored by cell phones. So he carries these 2 black rectangular objects that you can use to like...
Radio emitters.
Yes, 2 rectangular radio emitters, 1 in each front pocket. And I was like, you probably shouldn't carry like a cell phone per testicle. And he was like, no, it's fine. It's absolutely fine, no problems with that. And so we went through this whole thing where I was like finding all of these studies where I was like, hey, look, there's some indication that perhaps it's dangerous. And he kind of dismissed it. And then a few months later on Twitter, I saw that this guy, Nat Friedman, who's like a tech CEO, had gotten really curious about the quality of food in the Bay Area. And so because he's a tech CEO and he has all this money, he poured a bunch of money into producing something that's called Plastic List, where they collected 700 different samples from Bay Area foods, and then they tested them for endocrine disrupting chemicals. Specifically not microplastics, because microplastics are actual like particulates of plastics. They specifically were like, are there dissolved hormonally influencing chemicals
molecules
in the foods? Yes. And it was really stunning because they basically discovered that everything they tested was contaminated. How
do you get from cell phones to plastic? Sorry, I missed that.
Well, I think that it was just an illustrative point. So from a purely abstract rational world, there's no connection between the black rectangular radio emitters that we carry around every single day and press to our faces regularly dangerous, and is there perhaps poison in the food? Like there's no clear line between those. But I think that it's illustrative to use one positive test to suggest that there are other positive tests that you haven't yet been able to successfully conclude. Do you know what I mean by that?
What's a positive test?
So like if you go out into the world and you have this suspicion where you're like, hey, I think that there's probably toxic stuff in the food, and you test it and you find that there's a lot of toxic stuff, then I think you can logically say that there is a higher probability that there are other things that you have hunches about that you haven't yet been able to demonstratively prove.
The hunch.
The hunch. It strengthens the hunch. It does not give you a full story.
Before we completely move past the little rectangle things, did he dismiss this because it's a situation where you can find a study to back up your claim about almost anything these days? Is it that kind of thing?
No, he was just like, they're not good enough studies.
Okay.
There's like studies that show that it like screws with sperm anatomy and sperm motility and...
Like laboratory studies or observational studies?
Usually on rats and stuff, they like irradiate them and then they look at their testicles and they're like, look, their testicles are now strange. And their sperm is weird. And there was a bunch of observational studies where they would test people who were people that were carrying cell phones in their front pockets, and they would discover
Sorry. Cell phones in your front pocket is totally fine. The radio emitting black boxes in your front pocket. Go on, please.
The radio emitting black boxes in their front pockets were
sponsored by Verizon. So did they take the actual...
This is going to be really funny to clip later when we're trying to make shorts and we can't actually find a place where we explain what this is about. Every single time. It's just a radio emitting black box.
Do the radio emitting black boxes have the same strength in the rats that they do in the front pockets of individuals who carry them in their
I
pockets?
mean, that's the thing. Like, I didn't go deep enough down into the rabbit hole to be able to say that this is equivalent, but there was a bunch of observational studies where they were like, hey, we took people that spend this number of hours on their phone, pressing it to their heads, or on their black box, pressing it to their head, or pressing it to their genital area, and this is what we discovered. And so you can look at that and you can be like, poorly controlled, untested, many variables at play. How do they know that this is actually the case and dismiss it? But I'm like, the results of the plastic list studies suggest that there's like a pervasive harm that can derive from technology that I think we should probably be a little bit more aware of. And if we're aware of it, then we can actually take steps to do something about it.
So it seems more demonstrable with these plastic studies that you've looked into.
So with the plastics studies, it's really interesting because you have an extra layer of it, which is, okay, so before it's like, well, we don't know that all of our food is contaminated. Okay, fine. And, you have gradually lowered testosterone levels all around the world, like all of these different things that suggest that something is going on, right? There's some kind of endocrine disrupting thing out there.
Or just maybe sedentary lifestyle leads to less testosterone. There's other explanations I could come up with that could be tested, I suppose.
There's either a lifestyle habit or some kind of urban phenomenon or something in the water that seems to be messing with hormone levels.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the fact that everybody's on birth control and the level of birth control is so high in the municipal water systems that mostly pull from rivers that it's just everybody's getting dosed with some low level of birth control and now we're all screwed. Like, that's possible. All of these things are possible.
I assume people have looked into all of these things.
There's not a lot. I mean, okay, so what I've discovered through looking at like environmental contamination stuff is that in general, nobody wants to see. Nobody wants to really look because the cleanup efforts are unimaginable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like,
okay, I see. Well, it's a cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day, right? It's like, if you really want birth control, and this is presumably the easiest, most convenient
most
way.
profitable. It's actually not, because there's like other methods that appear to work, like fertility tracking and pulling out, like all of these things work if practiced properly, but they're free and they depend on self-discipline as opposed to being a pharmaceutical pill, which is like, okay, those are harder.
It'd be kind of awesome to sell the pull-out method. Like, you could have a whole YouTube channel devoted to it or something. It seems profitable to me. Anyways.
Maybe an OnlyFans.
Not profitable to the pharmaceutical industry, though.
No, not at all. And so...
Who we love, by the way. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Where were you leading with this, though?
Okay, so you're telling me that people, and by the way, when you say people, I assume you mean government entities or universities that are funded by public grants or so forth, aren't really motivated to go after this topic because the remediation is inconceivable. And it in some ways conflicts with a profit motive in our society.
Like, you and I have looked at this in terms of wildfires a little bit, right? So we looked into this thing of like, what are
check, right?
Yeah. Do you remember?
I remember that check, which is that red junk they dump out of the airplanes during the forest fires, tends to cause serious harm to biological organisms. And some group, class action, sued the USDA, and they won, I think. And the USDA paid some money, but it also ended up coming up with a regulation where you basically couldn't spray it near a river, which turned out to be completely pointless because all the rivers are surrounded by mountains here. So they spray it on the mountainside and it just rolls down into the river anyways. So they have admitted to it in the past, but the remediation effort that they enacted was useless.
If you think about the landscape out here, right? And so there's just to the west of us, there's this big area that's burned a bunch of times over the course of the last 20 years. And to stop it from burning, they've dumped a bunch of phosphate on it. And so what does it look like to remediate a roadless stretch of wilderness? Like, it's literally not feasible. Like, there are not enough dollars. The technology is not there. It's just not possible. And so it's a lot easier to just not look at it than it is to look at it to be like, oh, well, we've created a really big problem and now there's all this pollution and it's going to the ocean. And
They also don't want to really stop using it, is the truth of the matter, because they don't have a better solution once these fires get out of control.
right, like the phosphate I think was dangerous. It's a proprietary chemical mix, and so there's actually no information about what's in it.
Really?
And so the groups that finally figured out that it was harmful did, if I remember correctly, they did mass spec analysis of it, figured out what compounds were there, and then showed that they were persisting in the environment. And so they have all these stabilizers and water resistant molecules in it that are, like they're PFAS. They're these like perfluoridated
They're
organic
homomimetics of
carbons.
some sort, eh?
PFAS, I'm not totally 100% sure the danger that PFAS poses. I don't think that it's the same as these like plasticizers. So like plasticizers are hormone mimetic chemicals. PFAS though, let's see. We have this like really amazing new setup where I can Google things. Right now the search has turned to I can look up whatever I want because I was very excited and I typed this into the search engine. Okay, so are PFAS hormone mimetic? So I can't totally read that. let's zoom it, boys. Okay. Okay, they disrupt normal reproductive function. Okay, so they alter hormone secretion. So they're a different class of compounds. They're not the same as plasticizers, but they play the same function in the body, which is that they just make the hormone systems go haywire.
Okay.
And they're in all of these red firefighting foams. And so I'm like, okay, we're basically spraying chemicals that screw with reproduction abilities all over the landscape. That's not good. And I wanted to go through the plastic list stuff because I think it's just really interesting. Like, I'm not really alarmed by it.
But I don't totally buy that there's no remediation available either, right? I mean, this is a huge rabbit hole, but the firefighting situation out here is preposterous.
Yeah.
And they had a grip on it for a long time, from what I understand, with regard to the fire towers and the smoke jumpers and the brush control and so forth. And there's a lot of really strange behavior associated with these forest fires lately and the way that they deal with them.
Well, so I
But-
can give you the bottom line on that, which is that they're basically like, we can't keep the forests from burning. We need to stop keeping the forests from burning because we're creating massive time bombs downstream of our fire suppression efforts. Because fire is a normal part of the landscape. Like, I sound like such like an EPA or I don't know, FDA representative, USDA representative. The USDA actually controls the Forest Service, which I didn't realize until a couple of years ago. If you don't let the forest burn, it just builds up fuel. And so if you have a fire every single year, okay, you'll have small fires. If you have a fire every 5 years, okay, it just like burns up all of the stuff that's dead and you're okay. But if you go 100 years without a serious fire, I don't know what you expect. Like,
Well, the question is whether they're as big as they naturally would be, or if these are arson-related, human-created situations that just wouldn't be happening otherwise.
I mean, for example, the Paradise fires in California a few years ago. I don't know if you remember this, like big fires in central California. As far as I can tell, they were caused by power lines sparking. And yeah, you can be like, oh, well, PG&E didn't maintain the power lines, and so they sparked, and so it's man-made. But I'm like, we have dry lightning storms. These things will burn.
Wasn't the pre-FOS check solution, though, it's for municipalities to keep the underbrush cleared in these forests? Wasn't there more of an effort to do that in the past?
I think around towns, yeah. So it's like if you have basically a periphery, If you have like and this is the new thing, which is that like a lot of the problems that are starting to happen is that the new insurance regulations are like you can't have a tree within 100 feet of your home or something. It's not the fact that you can't have a dead tree within 100 feet of your home. So you can't have a tree, period. Because the regulations aren't that smart. They're basically like trying to create defensible perimeters, and so you can't have shrubbery by your house. You can't have plants by your house. And so like I have a feeling that that passing that on to people is going to make it really difficult for people to actually live in nice, cozy houses.
All right, I'm getting you into sucker trails. I want to learn about the plastic research that you've been doing.
Do you feel like we covered the fire stuff though?
I think so. I mean, I'm just not sure. I understand that there's motivation to not remediate these because it's expensive or requires a bunch of different levers to be pulled, and things might have to be done differently in the case of each one of these inventions, right? Like, we need a new way to measure people's shoes other than x-rays, you know? And it's like, oh, that's a pain in the ass because we got all these x-ray machines. Like, there's always going to be some force working against you in terms of changing the way you do stuff. I get that. So you were trying to convince Alosha that there was actually reason to be skeptical of these technologies. It started with the little black boxes. Then you moved on to plastics because they seem to have more data that's robust associated with them.
Well, I was really excited because I found this study. So there's the guy, Nat Friedman. He was the CEO of Github, and Github is this code repository where you can keep track of your code base and how you change it. And so you start a project and you start to write, and then as you work on it, you post your code there so that it keeps track of it so you can revert it back to other versions, and it's called like version control. It's very useful. Everybody uses it. It's like he invented a tool that everybody uses, and now he has more money than he knows what to do with, and so he's started all these projects. One of them is they're trying to use machine learning to decode the Herculaneum papyri, which is like there's a bunch of burned ass scrolls from the library in Pompeii that are still scrolls. Like they're still folded up, and they're basically just these husks that they've dug up. And they're working on ways to be able to scan them, make these stacks, and then use algorithms to figure out what the letters are on the pages so that they can basically reconstruct a vast quantity of literature from the ancient worlds. Like, if they figure out how to do this and they're making decent steps, I think that the estimates are that we're going to have like 100x more original documents from those days than we ever did before. It's going to be really funny.
And they're using like PET scanners or something?
CT maybe?
So it turns out all these guys end up with cancer 5 years later.
I mean, maybe. They're just like standing in the scanner. Yeah.
All right, so those are two very different projects. So he's scanning stuff and then he's investigating plastics.
Well, so he epitomizes this philosophy that's kind of taking root in the Bay Area, which is that like you can just do stuff. If you have a passion for something and you're interested in figuring it out, and in the case of Nat Friedman, if you have money, you should just dump your money into it and figure it out. So he hired a team that was programmers and scientists and doctors and went out, collected these samples, found a lab to test them, and put together a database of all of the results. They're very, very careful to be like, hey, this isn't data that you should freak out about. This isn't data that is set in stone. This is just something interesting that we found. Use this as your stepping stone for further research. But they did find some really crazy things.
All right, what did they find?
All right, well, let's go look at the list. We can use our fancy dancy screen. Okay, so when you go to plasticlist.org, you basically get this big table. And the table has all kinds of things that they've tested on the left of it. So like whole food spaghetti, Celsius water, almond milks, Starbucks, Gatorades, like Nestle stuff. Like they've just tested everything. Across the top, you have the various chemicals that they've tested for. And then you can organize the table according to these, I think there's 18 of them. And you can tell like what stuff has contaminants in it. And so I think that I want to go...
What's this color code about? It's whether it's outside of the range, I suppose?
Yeah, these are elevated ranges. And so if you go to the report tab, they wrote, I think, 20,000 words on it or something. And they listed all of the different compounds that they looked at. And so when they're testing for these hormone disrupting chemicals, what they're doing is they're looking for two types of additives that are added to plastics to make them soft. And that is phthalates and bisphenols. And so phthalates and bisphenols are both known to be endocrine disrupting chemicals. You probably remember a few years ago, everybody switched away from drinking water out of, for a while, like cig bottles were really popular. There was like aluminum bottles. Do you remember? Like it was very, very
I had an
popular for a
aluminum
while.
bottle. I had an aluminum bottle.
It was probably a cig, like SIGG. It was a very popular brand for a while.
I think it was stainless steel, actually. But anyways.
Was it when I knew you
Yeah.
already? That one was a stainless steel one.
Yeah.
That was so we had the stainless steel one because it was the next generation after the aluminum bottles when people were like, oh shit, you probably shouldn't be drinking out of aluminum containers because aluminum is probably linked to dementia, like all of these other things.
Yeah, it's only safe when you inject it into your body.
I would like to remind everyone that this podcast is sponsored by Moderna. Please do not cancel us. Everything is fine. Everything is copacetic. Everything is good.
People were scared of like BPA for a while too, right?
They were scared of BPA, and so which is a
Which was like
bisphenol.
Nalgene bottles and stuff.
No, so Nalgene bottles are BPA free.
Sorry, sorry, Nalgene.
Is the Nalgene in the room with us now? Nalgenes are, because they're like laboratory grade products, they're free of a lot of these plasticizer chemicals. It's a very
The
hard
softeners,
plastic.
I see.
It's a very hard plastic, but it's like the squishy water bottle that you have that your Calistoga or whatever comes in, that probably is leaching plastic into your water.
Okay.
And so, where are they going with this?
You were talking about the different chemicals that they were testing. Phthalates and bisphenols are the two that are softeners.
Yeah. And then there's like phthalate substitutes because people were like, oh crap, there's like, we suddenly realized that there's all these problems with the phthalates. And so we're going to see if we can come up with other stuff that isn't phthalates but does the job of them. And I'm like, I was looking into the history of plastics and I was really astounded by the fact that this is probably a move in the right direction.
What is probably a move?
Okay, so some of the first plastics were like Bakelite. They were called Bakelites. It's really funny because all of the first plastics were named for the people that invented them. And so they all, like the guy who invented it, I think was called Baker. And so the plastic he invented was called Bakelite. And it was everywhere. Like if you think of a 1940s plastic device, like a rotary phone or something like that, that's got this kind of like shiny brownish plastic that it's made out of, that's Bakelite. What do you think Bakelite is made out of?
I don't know.
It is a mix. Oh, go ahead. You're going to say something.
No, it's okay.
It is a mixture of phenol and formaldehyde that is solidified into a resin under high temperature and pressure. And if you heat Bakelite, the resin off-gases and you are inundated with phenol and formaldehyde fumes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And so I'm
And
like,
that's where you get that lovely plastic smell from, I suppose. Hot plastic.
well, so Bakelite isn't used anymore because it's so toxic.
Unless you like those vintage telephones.
Yeah, don't heat your vintage telephone. Use only at room temperature. And so I'm like, okay, there's no question that phenol and formaldehyde are crazy harmful. And so we've moved away from stuff.
Although that might not be obvious to everyday people. But, if you spend any time working in a laboratory, you use these chemicals to dissolve biological matter regularly, right? I guess that would be my first encounter with them. Like, I wouldn't know shit about phenols and so forth if I hadn't actually worked with them.
That's a really good point.
I'm just like, sometimes we get a little too deeply nerdy here. Yeah. But those are really interesting compounds because we use them to homogenize cells and extract DNA. And it's pretty gnarly stuff. It'll dissolve your finger too if you spill it.
But so this is I discovered while I was doing research for this episode. For a long time, they thought that polymers didn't exist. Like they didn't realize that there was a thing called a polymer. Like, it was the idea that you could have a long chain of identical molecules interwoven with each other to produce a hard substance was under serious debate at the turn of the century. So like when plastics were first being invented, they would basically like Dow Chemical would like bake something in an oven and it would get this like gloopy substance that would harden over time, and they like didn't know what it was, which is crazy to me, but I suppose it makes sense, right? Because it's like the same way they had to figure out what the hell oxygen was.
Yes, I mean, analytic science is brand new. It's always shocking to me. I run into that teaching these kids all the time too.
In
Where
what
I'm like,
way?
I don't know, I'm just like, God, it's crazy. 100 years ago, we thought the entire universe was the Milky Way galaxy, but it's just because the analytic methods weren't solid. Like the technology wasn't there to really see further.
And so this is the case with like tons of this stuff.
That's
So-
crazy though. So they didn't realize that even fuels and hydrocarbons were these polymeric chains and stuff like that.
I don't think so.
Interesting.
I mean, maybe like for hydrocarbons, I did not go that deep into this. This was like
But you're talking about like some sort of synthetic plastics and
synthetic plastics that they were producing in the laboratory. I can dig it up if you wanted to.
stuff. That's all good.
But
Okay, so take me back around to this study.
yeah, so they basically look at all 18 of these chemicals, and what I was saying is that after talking to my brother, it's the question now becomes, now that they've shown that they're in all of these different foods.
I think we haven't shown that yet. Maybe we can go through that a little bit deeper.
Okay. Sorry, I'm jumping around. Okay, so let's go to the results. So DHEP is one of the phthalates, and so basically there's like two categories of phthalates. One of the categories of phthalates, these 1 through 11, are ones that have either been phased out or are known to have negative health effects. And then these ones down here are the phthalate substitutes. And so there's like, this doesn't necessarily lend itself to radio very well because these are all like very long names and acronyms and things like that. But there's basically three classes of products. Phthalates that people realize are bad for you, that should be phased out and not in high use. Bisphenols that people also recognize are probably bad for you. And then these phthalate substitutes that haven't been tested very well. And so if you go back over here, like one of the questions that came up over this report, so I've organized by like, what is the food that contains the most of these, this first kind of phthalate, one of the ones that should be phased out.
That has not yet been.
Well, so this is the thing. Like, there's a lot of contamination in the food supply chain that they're kind of like, we don't totally understand where this is coming from because like they shouldn't be there. But this is the thing that has the highest level of phthalates is actually a powdered milk from 1952 Korean War rations. And so one of the things that they did with this is they weren't just testing modern foods that they picked around the Bay Area. They were also trying to figure out if plastics had entered the food supply more over time. And they're kind of using the Korean War rations as being illustrative of the fact that there was a decent amount of plastic in the food supply before. But I have a feeling that it might just be an indication of the fact that the US Army was feeding plastic.
Yeah, did they have a modern war rations? Like that's a strange thing to compare without. It's strange to pick something from the military as opposed to just picking something off the shelf.
I think that there's probably not that much.
Yeah.
It's like
It's a sampling
war
error,
rations are like collector's items.
Sure.
And so like
Probably
I
it's
think
probably some warehouse like in the side of a mountain in Nevada too. That's just floor to ceiling Korean war rations.
Right, yeah, exactly. And so it's like, okay, but I think that they're just using this to illustrate. So like the top two foods that have these phthalates in them are these Korean war rations. But then there's also stuff like RX bars, the sweet green chicken pesto parm salad. We used to go to Sweet Green all the time when we lived in New York.
It's like a farm to table place, right?
Which is advertised as being super organic, super healthy, whatever the hell that means, but they have tons of these phthalates in their food, right? So we're looking at like 13,000 nanograms a serving. So one of the other things that's really astounding is, for example, this Whole Foods boneless beef ribeye steak, grass-fed, has an enormous amount of phthalates in it. And people are like, they don't know why, because if you look at this table, so they only had one of these samples, and it tests really high for 2 different kinds of phthalates, and very low for everything else, like below the level of detection for everything else, basically. And so they're kind of perplexed because they're like, we don't know if this is real, we don't know if this is accurate signal, or if this is just noise.
Wait, why would it be noise?
Well, because usually for most of these, they have 3 replicates.
I see.
So like in science, you have to have replicates. And this is one where they just have a single item. And it's like also a question of, okay, so if the steak's in a bag and you test the outside of the steak,
Yeah.
or if it's wrapped in that like plastic paper
They always are.
butcher stuff,
Yeah.
like which matters?
The same could be said for the sweet green people too, because they always put those plastic boxes together.
Yeah. I mean, I think that let's go through a couple more of these, and then because there's a couple of big surprises, and then we can go through. I want to show you a couple things from the report because they do a really good job of kind of writing up the things that they found.
That's cool. Yeah, I'd like to see what the biggest concentrated foods are, and then also look up those individual chemicals and see what their effects are on the human body.
Let's do it. Okay, so let's go back to this. Again, these are phthalates. So Korean War rations so this is the next kind of phthalate. Korean War rations, cocoa powder from Korean War rations, again, sweet green, war rations. Then there's this like protein shake that you could buy at the grocery store, Starbucks, In-N-Out, butter chicken from an Indian restaurant in San Francisco. Like all of these things have off the charts high levels of these phthalates in them, which is really. So at first I was like, this is really distressing. And this is like Wendy's burgers with cheese. At first I was like, this is really depressing. But if you look, like for the most part, these are things that you probably could have from first principles derived would probably not be great for you. Like bottled water. Okay, yeah, but like water in plastic bottles probably isn't great for you. Taco Bell Baja Blast. I'm like, okay, I even if it didn't have plastic in it, you could probably from first principles derive, not plastic, endocrine disrupting chemicals. You could probably derive the fact that it wasn't good for you. And so on some level it's alarming, but on a different level, I think that it's actually really just illustrating that if you can eat as many whole foods as you can, you'll probably be okay. Except, and this is really interesting, there are sometimes things that come up that have really high levels of certain of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that you wouldn't expect. Like, for example, there's this, Strauss is a big organic creamery out here on the West Coast. They sell all their milk in glass bottles. All their cows are supposed to be grass-fed. It's like they have this entire reputational arc that's based around the fact that they do really, really good work of growing good food, and yet they have high phthalates in their milk. It's inconsistent.
Which one is that?
It's this very top one, Strauss.
Now, what's the one that's
DIDP, which
the last one I just looked up is teratogen. So
this is diisodecyl phthalate.
I see. I'll look that one up. Yeah, the DBP, was it?
DBP, yeah.
Yeah, California suspects it's a teratogen.
Well, California suspects everything is a teratogen.
Isn't the teratogen like when people grow like little fetuses in their shoulders and stuff?
No,
like
that's
that?
a teratoma.
Oh, excuse me.
Teratogen, I think, is a mutagen. It's something that mutates DNA. What is it?
Oh, sorry. I thought. Okay, and then DDIP. Let's look at that one. I'm just really curious.
DIDP.
DIDP. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because I mean, it's really hard to tell which ones of these are dangerous or not, and I have some stuff that I want to show you about this.
EU does not think that it's a reproductive toxin. This one seems to have the least dangers known about it. Oh, wait. California says it causes reproductive toxicity. The European Union has not come to the same conclusion yet. Okay. So all these chemicals are going to show some toxicity, and some people are going to argue that they are. Some people are going to argue they aren't.
So I'm looking at this DIDP. So they actually have some low-grade information about health effects baked into the table. So if you click the title here, it'll basically take you down into it. And so if you look at DIDP, which is this diisodecyl phthalate, you can see that the EU set a limit of 150,000 nanograms per kilogram of body weight per day, which seems really high, but what do I know? And they used liver changes in dogs and newborn mortality in rats as the reason for changing the limits. And this is the case for a ton of the chemicals that are in this table. The limits are different for the EU and the United States. And so
California in particular, which seems really touchy about this stuff.
California's really touchy about this. It's touchy about everything. But for example, the EPA has no limit on this chemical. And a part of me wonders if this isn't because America's chemical industry. Like, I really hate to be conspiratorial about that. But I'm like, don't you think that it's reasonable that if all of the chemical companies are American, they're the, like, Dow Chemicals, the DuPonts, the 3Ms, that they would have an easier time lobbying the US government?
Yeah, for sure. I don't think that's that conspiratorial. That's just business. That's how it works. I mean,
God, you're so worldly and jaded.
I'm still trying to understand. Are all of these chemicals toxic? Like, somebody thinks in some context that they're toxic. And the foods that are popping up seem to be completely across the board. You're saying they're more associated with foods that are already bad for you. Is that what you're saying? Except for like the ribeye steak or something like that.
Well, that's the thing. But like, I'm looking at it and I'm like, again, I think that you can take this sort of data lets you build up hunches. And then the next level is to figure out how real that hunch is. And so I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, so the vast majority of the stuff that seems to pop up seems to be the stuff that's packaged or processed. The more steps between harvest and consumption that something goes through, it just seems like it accumulates plastics at every point.
That makes sense because we basically live in a plastic society. All of our technologies involve plastics in some sort. Even like our chairs that we're sitting on are probably made out of plastic, right? I mean, in some sense, they're petroleum products or something in that realm of polymeric substance.
Yeah.
So the more that your food has contact with man-made synthetic structures, the more chance it is that it's going to seep up these volatiles.
Yeah.
Okay.
So do you want to go through some of the other ones, or?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
like, we can also like say that like people get the point.
Yeah, well,
like,
we can link this. Yeah, we don't need to beat them with it. I mean, I think this is interesting. Okay. So is Alosha not convinced by this?
Well, nobody's really convinced by it because it's like the data's inconsistent, right? So it's like, okay, so for the Strauss thing, one of the samples is above the limits, but not all of them. And then there's also like weird stuff. So there's like down here you're seeing that like cafeteria food of just like beans, chicken, rice, and cauliflower has high levels of this of a certain type of phthalate. And so it's just hard to draw steady conclusions. Like this is and now I'm on to the fifth, sixth of these phthalates. Again, it's mostly Korean War rations. And mostly stuff that's prepared out in the world at restaurants. I guess there's some tap water that has this is diethyl phthalate, and the US limit is 800,000 nanograms per kilogram of body weight of this stuff, which again seems unbelievably high. They set the limit in 1988. But they don't really know if their limits are correct because they haven't done a ton of testing and the EU doesn't have a limit for it. And so I'm like, okay, well, how are you supposed to draw a reasonable conclusion off of this?
Yeah, you'd have to really go down the rabbit hole with each one of these. Right? Like with the cafeteria food, you'd have to go and see, well, how are they storing the ingredients and how are they serving them and what kind of utensils are they using to prepare them and
Yeah.
what plates are the kids eating off of? And
Yeah. And so like again, there's like another for this next phthalate, which is that nobody actually has any
this one's called DMP.
DMP, dimethyl phthalate. There's like a quarter of the products tested had DMP in it. The highest detections were in milk.
Whole organic milk
Yeah.
in a glass jar.
And so DMP is used as a plasticizer.
I mean, they might hook them onto use the udder pump things.
That's where they think that it's coming from. And so, let's see.
So there's no rhyme or reason. Our entire material civilization is contaminated with these hormone disruptors.
And what's really sad is that a lot of these hits are for things like prenatal vitamins. They're for, like, this is for baby formula. And it has high levels of some of these plasticizers. Let's just go through.
But the babies are fine, right? I guess that's what Alicia would say.
Well, we don't know, right? And it's like they do seem like they're fine. Like, and this is the thing. This isn't like phenol or formaldehyde, where you can really clearly like
they don't have acute toxicity.
Like if you handle phenol, your skin burns off.
Yeah.
Same with formaldehyde. Like there's no question that this stuff is hella toxic. You don't have to run studies.
I think formaldehyde goes to your optic nerve and makes you blind, actually.
Yeah, like these things are not. It's not hardly.
These are acute toxicities. That's different than what we're talking about.
Right, because these things are present in the environment at relatively low levels that are of questionable effect. And
so you'd have to do these ridiculous long-term exposure studies, and they're impossible to control in populations, and it's very hard to make conclusive studies that you could convince a committee at some government bureaucracy to pull this particular chemical.
Yeah.
Plus, it's not clear that there's alternatives that are safe. Is that true? Like, is there a way to make a soft, squishy water bottle that doesn't have something like this in it? I don't know.
No, I don't think that there is. And I mean, I think that that's really the thing is that, like, it probably should be... Oh, there's actually a really interesting thing about the water that I want to get to. But one of the things that I want to touch on is there's this meme that you shouldn't touch receipt paper. Have you heard this before?
I think you told me about it.
So I have some things that I'd like to show you. So I found out that receipt paper is actually a matrix that has BPA embedded in it, which then is exposed to this thermal printer head, and the it's BPS, bisphenol S, and the BPS is then able to interact with the dye in the receipt paper and turns black. And so there's a paper that did this crazy experiment where they enrolled people in a study. I think that it was like 20 or 30 people. And it's called Holding Thermal Receipt Paper and Eating Food After Using Hand Sanitizer Results in High Serum Bioactive and Urine Total Levels of Bisphenol A. And so what they did is, and this is a diagram which shows basically that inside of this system, you have three things. You have like the base paper that everything's printed on, and then you have the layer that's actually reactive to heat. And so there is the developer, quote unquote, which is these ringed molecules. And then there's these dye molecules. And when you heat it, the dye molecules migrate to interact with the bisphenol, and it turns dark. This stuff is not locked into a matrix, right? Because it's mobile. And so for a long time, there's been this discussion of like, do receipts leach chemicals? And if you look at the report on Plastic List, some of the absolute highest detections for bisphenols are in receipt paper. So they took receipt paper, they put it into liquid, and then they took that liquid and tested it. And so we're looking at 76 million nanograms of BPS per serving in this receipt. And this paper that I was looking at actually did this really clever thing. So they got people to wash their hands with hand sanitizer, and then they held a receipt paper for 4 minutes, and then with the receipt paper contaminated hand, they ate French fries.
How did this get past a ethics committee? This is amazing.
I mean, this stuff's in the environment anyways. Like, this is the crazy thing, is that we assume that this stuff is okay. There's receipt paper given to you like 1,000,000 times a day. If it's actually dangerous for you, that's astonishing. Like, we should stop giving people receipts immediately. Do you know what I mean?
But it's a known endocrine disruptor, right? It's so interesting.
Yeah, but like you can still buy plastic bottles that are endocrine disruptors, right? Like there's no regulation about the fact that you can't sell BPA. So they basically showed that when you held the receipt with wet hands, that it spiked your BPA concentrations, obviously like on your skin. But these are serum concentrations. And so they basically extracted blood from people after they ate with this contaminated hand and showed that they go from this low level spike the blood concentrations 15 minutes after exposure. And in some cases, basically, so what's really crazy is these studies seem to show that people are variably affected by it. And so there's some metabolic component where some people touch the paper and their serum concentrations don't spike, and other people, their serum concentrations spike and then they fall, and then other people, they spike and they maintain. So there's some kind of massive bio variability inside of this, which is really fascinating to me.
I wish they'd looked at hormone spikes as results, because it says here that in these zebrafish models that the men zebrafish. the men fish spiked estrogen levels and decreased testosterone levels after being exposed to BPS.
So I think I might have that paper here as well. Hold on one second.
But they could have looked at estrogen and testosterone in these patients while they were doing all this sketchy ethical science on them.
That's probably true. I can't. Did I not save that?
It's okay. We can just take their word for it on that one.
Well, it was a really interesting paper. So like a lot of these studies are really hard to do because, again, everybody's really biologically different, and so the reason that lab animals are really convenient is because if they're female animals, they're largely like synced in terms of their estrus, you know exactly where they are in their cycles, and so you can track hormone levels really tightly. The amount of money that you would need to be able to do the same thing for humans, to be able to like see hormone level changes, you'd need just a lot of baseline information, which I think makes it a lot trickier. And so you see that when people do these experiments, that they do these like really, usually in cells is where they do it with like reporter assays. And it makes everything really difficult. But I was trying to find evidence of the fact that there's actual...
By the way, it's not just receipts. It says 70% of household waste paper samples tested positive for
waste
BPS.
Paper? Like
indicating
toilet paper?
Like waste paper. What is waste paper? I think it's just like bills and crap. This says potentially indicating spreading of BPS contamination through paper recycling. So a lot of paper today is recycled paper, I suppose.
Yeah, I've been really suspicious about this. We ran into a girl the other day who I really liked her swimsuit, and I was like, I love your swimsuit. And she was like, thank you, it's made of recycled plastic. And I was like,
I also shuddered a little inside too, knowing that we were going to record this podcast today. God, I hope she's not listening right now.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I should have said something. I'm sorry. But it's like, I don't want to, people are anxious already. And I feel like dumping this thing of like, well, that's probably going to poison you through your skin as you sit in this 150-degree sauna. Like, I don't.
This is not going to be a popular podcast.
I beg to differ. Like, I think that what's really good is to know what is actually out there. Like, if you have no idea that receipts are this potent vector for hormone disrupting chemicals, you can never be like, you can never come up with a cohesive plan to be like, I don't need the receipt. right?
What about clothing stuff in general? Like, what are some of the common polymer-based clothings that we see?
Like nylon and rayon
Yeah,
and
any
like all of these
indication
things,
of hormone
polyester.
disruption with these things?
Well, do you remember those studies about the dogs wearing polyester underwear that I showed you a while ago? No? All right, hold on. Let's find these. I want to see if there's any last interesting pieces inside of these. Oh, okay. So this is a West Coast thing. Anybody who lives on the West Coast, or really in the Intermountain West as well, knows In-N-Out, right? And I have, I, I grew up eating In-N-Out, and I love In-N-Out. I think it's one of the greatest inventions of man. And then the last few times that we've gone to go get In-N-Out, my gums have bled profusely afterwards. And I was like,
I didn't eat the fries though. My gums did not bleed.
You did
And I
not
didn't
eat the bun or
either.
the fries.
I just take my receipt and pick up the hamburger, just
It's well known that it's protective. But In-N-Out shows up. So an In-N-Out cheeseburger, animal style, has really high levels of one of these bisphenols, which it doesn't have a safety limit. And so it's just like, okay, maybe it's nothing.
Again, it is served in a little plastic dish, like a paperized, plasticized dish.
Absolutely. And so like the Burger King Whopper with cheese is also predictably. So now we're moving into these substitutes. So we've left the bisphenols, which again everybody kind of knows aren't bad for you. And so these are the substitutes which literally have no safety margins on them whatsoever, because they're just like, if you look at, so this is DEHT. Oh, this one does 1 million nanograms per kilograms of body weight. It's like, okay, that just seems.
Isn't that also known as a milligram? Sorry.
It is. And actually they point out that like this amount of plastic, so it's like almost 6 million nanograms of this plasticizer, they're like, you can measure that. Like that's like you can take one of those like tiny little scoops. It's about the size of 3 poppy seeds. So like that's the amount of plastic chemical that you're getting out of a Whopper when you eat it. Which, Doug, stop eating Whoppers if you're listening to this. And I don't know. I mean, like the rest of these were just, there's like this one anomalous result for the Stanford University meal.
But then the question is like, does it really matter?
Okay, so that's the question. Does it really matter?
Question, right?
Okay, so the rest of these don't have anything.
So there's all these studies. They're like, yeah, it causes some interactions with the endocrine system, with hormones. But does it matter?
Okay.
Can life go on even though your hormones are disrupted?
No. I don't think so. I mean, life can go on. Like, this is the thing.
Like women take birth control. They're fine, right? I'm kind of joking. I mean, there are.
Yeah, but okay, again, unpopular opinion. I would probably put that. I know that it is a life-changing substance for many people.
Endocrine disruptor.
I would say endocrine like regulator, because I mean, there's a difference between something that you're taking that is like a known bullet target interaction, right? Where like we know women's cycles well enough to be able to say, if you take this concentration of estrogen at this frequency, this is what happens to your downstream fertility hormones and what produces the lack of implantation and the lack of menstruation. Like these are on-target effects.
Targeted, yeah.
These things are really difficult, and this is actually what I wanted to pull up, which is that there's this receptor called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. And the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, I'm not going to get too nerdy about this because I think that nobody wants to do that, but it's basically considered to be a environmentally sensitive receptor. It basically just kind of integrates all sorts of data from the environment that it's getting and then passes it on to all of these different genes that are important for neural function, oxidative stress control, and the activities of these antioxidant enzymes. And so, okay, what does that mean? So you basically have a receptor in the body that is super broad spectrum. It's tuned to accept whatever hydrocarbon ringed compounds are in the environment, to take those compounds and then to affect gene changes, because it actually gets taken into the cell, it moves into the nucleus, and it affects the transcription of the DNA. And what they find is that many of these compounds, the bisphenols and the phthalates, are most likely acting through this receptor. And so this receptor is making global changes to your ability to deal with oxidative stress and your ability to deal with, with your ability to properly produce genes that are involved in neural function. What does that mean downstream? I'm like, I don't know, but it probably is something that we should be way more careful with rather than, should be cool, right? This falls into my bin of like, hey, we should treat the things that are produced by the better living through chemistry fraction of society as suspicious until proven otherwise, rather than the other way around.
And what does your little brother have to say about this?
He's kind of like, I don't think that any of this is actionable. There's like one of the biggest results on this was that there's this drink called boba. Do you know what boba is?
The little tapioca bubble things?
I know, you'd never stoop to consuming boba, which I appreciate about you.
Not a fan.
It's
really sugary and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems somehow undignified for you to consume boba.
But it's got lots of microplastics.
It's insane. It's like one of the like off the chart samples. And so and they drink a lot of boba. So
Sorry, these aren't microplastics.
These are endocrine disrupting chemicals.
They're dissolved. They're solubilized plastics.
Yes. And so it's like downstream of what the plastics would be. And so he's just kind of like, I don't know, maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll change my behavior. Maybe I won't. But
because that's the hardest part of this whole conversation is like, how do we know that these levels are actually resulting in problems for our bodies?
I think that anything that changes gene expression, and these compounds are known to change gene expression, is suspect. And there's also clear evidence of reproductive changes. So I want to go back to this plastic list report, but before I do that, I found a paper that has basically a figure where it shows what all these phthalates look like. And I know that this is basically nominative determinism, or at least adjacent. But don't these all look like those things in the Sentinels in the Matrix?
They do look like little Matrix bots that are cleaning up the underground.
Or patrolling the underground, and I'm like, these look to me...
They're very symmetric and ringed. For people who are just listening, these are very beautiful looking chemicals.
They are beautiful chemicals.
I'm seduced. That's a handsome chemical right there.
I have the feeling looking at these where I'm like, they're shaped just like stuff that the membranes in our cells are made out of. So you basically have this ringed head, and then there's charged molecules on the head. And then you have these long hydrocarbon tails that hang off the bottoms of them. And so if you were to look at like, so our membranes are made out of these things called phospholipids. And so phospholipids, I should probably look for phospholipid structure, have a very, very similar thing where they have this kind of hydrophilic head.
Not a ring structure though.
Not a ring structure, almost never a ring structure. But they have a hydrophilic head, and then they have these long tails on the end. And you can have different heads, and based off of the different heads, they have different chemical properties. Based off of the tails, they have different packing densities in the membranes. And so the more of these unsaturated fatty acids that you have that are kinked, the more fluid your membranes are. The more saturated fatty acids you have, the more stiff the membranes are. And so you have to maintain the proper balance of these in order to not have membranes that are either too fluid or too solid. But from what I understand, these heads and the chemical structure of them is really important for the proper functioning of membranes as well. Where it's like the outer surface of cells needs to have the right kind of lipids on it in order for cell-cell communication to work, in order for receptors to operate properly, in order for endocytosis, where it's like the cells take this portion of themselves and pull things into the cell.
Sure.
In order for all of that to work properly, you have to have the right lipids. And if I look at phthalates, and this is totally my own supposition, I'm like, these look like they would screw with that.
Is there any evidence they get incorporated into the cell membranes like that?
I didn't look. I could look it up now, but it feels like it would be kind of a waste of time.
Okay. So we don't really know the answer. I mean, the unfortunate answer. I'm just playing the Alosha role here for your little brother. You can't really say whether these things are screwing up our bodies or not. You can just say that in large doses, they mess with the hormones. Over extended periods with small doses, who knows?
I mean, I don't know. It's like, I think that if you look, so one of these papers, which I think that it's this one, but the one that I showed just a second ago, the phthalate structures. If you look at the organ and tissue damage, I haven't gone through each individual one of these to make sure that you can find it, but it's like, okay, so reduced diameter and thinning of the epithelium of the uterus. A change in testicular histoarchitecture.
In rats, right?
In rats.
And we don't know the dosage either.
We don't know the dosage, but so if we go back to the plastic list guys are basically like, this is clearly something that is still somewhat nebulous, and it's really funny because when you come to the page, there's a little disclaimer, which they're like, we're not saying that this is the final say on any of this stuff, and you shouldn't treat it as hard fact, and you have to promise that you're not going to panic when you look at it, which I think is very cute. Because their whole point is they're like, we just need to come up with standards that make sense and things that are actually based in reality based off of recent testing. Because they're like, some of the standards were established in 1953. And so if you look back, if you look at the publication rate for papers, so this is the total number of articles about chemical classes over time. And so if you set a standard for one of these phthalates or one of these bisphenols, one of these
The beastie phenols.
one of these bisphenols prior to 1980, even honestly, like prior to 2000 even. Look at how little research has been done. These are total numbers of paper. I've lost my ability to
Printed
talk.
on recycled paper, which is plasticized.
Yeah, each one of these is printed on receipt paper. There's 700 papers on bisphenols. There's 800 papers on phthalates. Like, this is...
That's actually a good sign that people are studying them now.
It is, but the problem is that a lot of the safety profiles were established in this window.
Right.
And so the question is, okay, well, what have we learned in the last 20 years of studying these things that actually gives us a better sense of what's happening? And I think that the argument can be made that we've learned a lot, and that we should probably reevaluate these things, and that we should be testing our food.
Yeah, what was that?
This is this is one of the phthalates, and so they were looking at a.
Those are rat balls, weren't they?
Yeah. So they were looking.
I know a rat ball when I see one.
You've known. I've been around the block once or twice. Seen my fair share of rat balls. So the question is like, okay, are these chemicals bad for males? And to go through the studies. And so they're like, okay, so we looked at one study. They fed this phthalate to 17 male, 17 female rats at 8 different doses, ranging from high to ridiculously high. So like massive, massive doses, 5 times higher than the EPA limit. They tracked 3 generations of rats, and they showed clear reproductive damage, especially in males. High doses had severe fertility problems. They couldn't mate properly. Fewer pregnancies occurred. Their testicles showed severe damage.
Severe damage.
The the seminiferous tubules were shriveled and contained only nurse cells instead of developing sperm cells. The highest dose group of this, and again, these are like really, really high doses. They couldn't produce any offspring at all, and so they could only track them for 1 generation because they couldn't reproduce.
Sorry, remind me which chemical this is?
This is the DEHP.
Okay, I don't know if I looked that one up.
Okay,
But
let's look
I mean, yeah,
We can look it up.
That's interesting enough on its own.
DEHP phthalate.
I go to the Wikipedias.
Wikipedias.
Yeah.
Cause cancer and birth defects or other reproductive harm.
And which foods was this found in? Do you remember?
Let's look. Hold on. Port.
DHP.
I think this is like their very first one.
Ah, okay, the first one we
DEHP.
looked at with the
So,
Korean War rations.
Korean War rations, RX bars, sweet green chicken salad,
That's
Whole
right.
Foods ribeye, Shake Shack cheeseburger,
1962 Army rations.
another
The boneless
ribeye
ribeye,
steak.
yeah, packaged in plastic, I betcha.
Almost certainly.
Starbucks matcha latte.
In-N-Out cheeseburger.
They didn't have those when I worked at Starbucks.
Subway. I ate a lot of these in
Eat
college.
fresh.
I will tell you that much.
Tuna melts. Not even counting the metals, right?
No.
Okay, so a lot of fast food, but some
like,
weird ones.
wild
Oh, this
tuna?
is the Stanford Dining Hall again.
Stanford Dining Hall food. Taco Bell chicken burrito. Chick-fil-A. Chipotle.
I mean, the fast food ones are less interesting, right? Because it's like, I think people who are eating fast food, I know when I eat fast food, I'm just kind of like, well, screw it. Like, I'm not doing this for my health, you know?
I know, but okay,
It's kind of like cigarettes or something. Like, people aren't smoking cigarettes so that they can strengthen their endocrine system.
No, but I think that if
But we shouldn't lie to ourselves. Like, we should be honest. Like, this isn't actually food. This is pleasure, mouth pleasure.
that's true, but I'm like, okay, so cigarettes have pictures of people's gnarly ass cancers on them.
Do they do that in this country? I know they do it in other countries.
Maybe in other countries. Here too, I think
I mean,
California
there's like a
might
warning I've
mandate
seen on
it.
these boxes.
I think California might mandate it.
Really?
Maybe. I don't know.
Interesting.
It's been a long time. But and so I think that people recognize they're like, okay, cancer somewhere down the road. But I think that if you were like, hey, cigarettes shrink your balls, I feel like that might have a different hit than cancer. Like there's something so like personal and immediate and evocative.
Fast food shrinks your balls.
Yeah, like doesn't
But
that
you don't do it all the time.
some people do, and maybe
Yeah.
they don't know, right? Because it's like one thing to be like, okay, this is gonna make me fat. The next thing is it's gonna make me fat and impotent. I'm like, surely that's gotta tip the scales more than not. Am I crazy? Maybe
I
I'm
don't know.
crazy.
I mean, I have no idea. I'm not a huge fast food person. I really,
were you ever?
not really. I had like a slight Taco Bell addiction in college, like late at night, you know, after going out and stuff. Sometimes I would make the drive. There's like a really nice drive from my dorm over the hill and through the woods to the Taco Bell in town that was like 20 minutes away, so you could listen
So
to a
romantic.
record, you know, with your
Ooh.
buddies late at night. It was fantastic.
That's
The
beautiful.
perfect amount of time, basically, that drive there and
Record's
back.
that short?
There and back.
Yeah. Or I was like imagining you with a record player in the car.
Skipping again. Okay, so
So let's see. Is there anything surprising on this list? Let's just look at it. Okay, so Blue Bottle is like a really schnoo coffee variety in San Francisco. So that's a little surprising. And like I would expect
stuff tastes acidic to me.
it does taste really acidic.
But yeah, it's fancy.
Prenatal vitamins.
It's like $10 a cup of coffee.
Women's prenatal vitamins have 10,000 nanograms per serving. That seems like a lot. And that seems like it probably shouldn't be in there. Like, why? And the rest of these, yeah, it's just basically stuff in plastic. I mean, organic long grain rice probably shouldn't be in there. Boneless, skinless chicken breast. So this reminds me of a thing. I have a friend who at some point was like, you would not believe what can be marked as organic as long as they use organic fertilizers and everything else, but they could be using really dirty water to water it.
Yeah.
And so if you're a chicken farmer and you're raising your chickens organically, but you're getting water from some kind of really industrially polluted source, that could be a huge source of these plastics because now they're just inundating the animals.
So the final step really is pegging this to societal changes as a result of it, like population level dynamics. Is that what is it Shanna Swan? Is that her name? Who's doing this kind of work where she's actually trying to show how males are becoming less male and females are becoming less female, and then trying to somehow correlate that positively to what we're seeing here with the rise of these hormone mimetics or
Well,
these
she's
hormone
basically,
disruptors.
yeah, she's trying to show that hormone levels are falling. And so if we finish this thing that we were reading about, the mammalian effects, is that these,
Here comes the rap balls.
the rep balls, T minus
warning.
3, 2, 1. But before we get there, so basically the first study we looked at was injecting this DHEP. So this is one of these phthalates, and they found that at really high doses, complete and total endocrine disruption, to the degree that the rats couldn't actually reproduce. The males specifically, which is really interesting. And then there's another study in 2016 where, here come the rat balls, Nelly and Pamanji injected DBP, where let's go look at DBP. DBP is dibutyl phthalate, which is 100,000 nanograms per kilogram of body weight, set in 1987. And they set it in 1987 with a confidence of low, citing increased mortality in rats. The EU has a 10 times lower limit at 10,000.
So this stuff
nanograms.
just straight up kills you.
Yeah, reproduction toxicity, developmental toxicity, 5 times more potent than the previous phthalate that we looked at.
DEHP.
DEHP. Okay, so what happens? They injected these adult male rats at 2 doses, 100 milligrams per kilogram and 500 milligrams per kilogram, which, to be fair, is higher than the doses that we're looking at over here in even the highest DBP containing foods, right?
I have a solution.
Yes.
They should just pass a law that you have to rename these substances with something that reflects what they actually do to your body. So, like, you could rename DBP as ball roaster. Testicle smasher, something like that.
I think that might be...
It might actually dissuade people, then they would know what they're actually getting into.
This is... I
Like,
think
would
might be
you
onto
buy
something.
paper towels that had testicle smasher in them?
Depends. It depends on what you're looking
There's something
to
about these
achieve.
acronyms. Like, seriously, there's something about the acronyms that obscure. Like, it's very hard for me to even keep track of which does which at this point.
I actually think that I think broadly speaking, you can assume that they all smash balls and ovaries across the board. But
You could have creatives, like, each one could be like a really
specific
fun,
type, yeah.
creative spin on testicle smashing.
Yeah, like the new horror landscape of it. I do think that we should, because scientists have a tendency of naming things kind of stupidly. Like, there's some gene called like Sonic the Hedgehog, and it's some developmental gene, and I'm like, that's dumb. Testicle smasher phthalates. I think that's in the right direction.
If it informs the consumer to make better choices, I guess.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for people to keep up on this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of looking for a road forward, it's like, this is very obscure, esoteric information for the average person on the street.
Yes. And I think that what's going to happen is that as this becomes more entrenched in the public consciousness, we're going to start to see more and more ratings organizations. There's going to be an organization to which you can submit your food, and it will test it for you, and it will tell you if it's clean. And it's going to do this for all products at the grocery store, and it's going to be able to tell you, is this okay to eat? Is this not okay to eat? And we're probably going to find out some things that are really surprising along the way.
Yeah.
Can we finish this, testicle shrinkage?
Back to the balls.
Back to the balls. Like, this is nuts. I will say that they gave them more of the DBP of the phthalate than you would consume, even if you were eating the foods that have high DBP in the study. The Korean War rations...
Like if you were living off of Korean War rations?
You'd have to eat a lot of Korean War rations at 1 million nanograms a serving in order to get 100 mgs per kilogram, right? Because isn't that like 1
You'd have to eat 100 of them, right?
Right. And so, like, that's a lot. Nobody's eating that many Korean War rations. But the idea is that over time, it builds up.
I wouldn't say nobody, but yeah.
Can we make sure that Can we make sure that that's actually correct?
Like the
That
translation?
yeah, like
Well,
a million
isn't
is a million nanograms 1 milligram?
1,000 nanograms is a microgram, right? And 1,000 micrograms is a milligram.
1 milligram. Okay.
It's good to practice this stuff because I've absolutely screwed this up on a podcast before.
Yeah,
In recent memory.
I know, and I just like
With
my
nanoteslas or the microteslas.
my innumeracy will be the death of me.
Micro is 10 to the minus 6. Nano is 10 to the minus 9th.
Exactly.
Milli is minus 3.
So like to get this level, if you were 50 kilograms, you would have to eat 50 Korean War rations a day, which is a lot. Nobody's doing that. Is there anything else that's even close to being that high? No. So it's like here you'd have to eat an astonishing amount of sweet green chicken pesto parm salad in order to even approach this. But at high levels, you can see what happens to the testicles of these poor control rats, which I had no idea rat testicles were so big. Seems big,
Half a centimeter on that one.
right?
Yeah. I mean, rats are mostly balls. Like if you see the male ones, they're huge. They're enormous
It's
balls.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
The more you know. But so you see a drastic reduction, like in volume and size. And I'm like, this should be printed on the side of...
How long were they fed, by the way, this chemical?
They were
longer?
injected it. 2
Yeah.
doses once a week for 4 weeks.
Okay, so if you're eating Korean War rations every single day for, say, an entire war's worth of time, like it might actually start to matter.
And
That's a different question than this study looks at, obviously.
And it all depends. Like, how does it build up in the body? Like, how does it get metabolized? Does it work its way out, or does it stay for a long time? And they managed to show, too, in the same study that you get these really malformed sperms, which are just
Crooked.
so sad, yeah. They're just, like, crooked and non-functional, and they, like, don't have heads. Like, banana-shaped head. I didn't realize that rat sperms were so weirdly shaped. Isn't that kind of a weird shape for sperms?
Is that the control one?
Yeah, that's the normal one.
Interesting. It's got a hook on it, too.
It's got a real hook on it. I think the ones that aren't properly hooked are the ones that are...
I'm not enough of a sperm expert to see the differences here. The balls are easier for me.
As the representative sperm correspondent, you feel like you don't have the expertise to say?
I'm going to have to call back to the station on this one.
Yeah, so it's like the ones whose testicles had shrunk couldn't breed. And they make this case that like the phthalate created oxidative stress. And this is the thing that I was saying earlier, which is that this like aryl hydrocarbon receptor is involved in regulating so many genes that when it senses these compounds, it screws with the set point of oxidative stress in the body.
Which is metabolism, essentially.
Metabolism and your ability to respond to the damages of breaking apart the things that you're eating. And so like Stephanie Seneff's work feeds into this. I think that guy who does the keto fasts for cancer, Seyfried's work feeds into it. We had somebody else
I
recently.
need to get Seyfried on the phone again.
Barbara McCorkey?
McClintock? No.
No, there was Barbara
Corky.
was the one with the
Who's Barbara
obesogens.
McClintock? She's an author?
Barbara McClintock was the one who discovered transposons, jumping genes, and got a Nobel Prize for it. She's badass. The point is that it's out there. I think it's important to know, and even though you could have probably derived this from first principles, like don't eat things that come in packages, I think that
Everything comes in packages.
I think that it's really easy. That's true. But I think that it's really easy to dismiss that as like fat shaming or telling people what not to eat on some moralistic basis. And I'm relieved that there's a database that appears to show that the stuff is actually filled with endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in your body in levels at levels that aren't being tested in the lab, because every single one of these studies that we look at tests one at a time. One chemical, one course, and then they look at the effects. We're filled with these chemicals. Like a real study to look at what's actually happening to us would be going out, collecting blood from people categorizing what the mixture of these compounds is in their bodies, and then recreating those mixtures at those levels, and then testing them. Like, that would be really informative, I think. Because what's the actual biological effect of having like 40 different kinds of phthalates and bisphenols in your body?
I think we're going to have to wait for nanodrones to pull off that study. Send the little swarms of mosquitoes out to just suck on random people and analyze their blood.
Bill Gates is already planning on it. Brian Johnson, that guy who's planning to live forever, is actually planning to launch like a food testing service in the next year or so. So
Interesting.
I bet he'll make you pay through the nose for it. But I think that people are starting to get wise to it. And so, like, Plastic List is a good resource for this endocrine stuff. Labdoor is a really good resource for heavy metals and contaminants and like arsenics and things
It's
like
very
that.
limited, though, yeah.
Highly limited. But there's also vendors that sell with third-party testing.
Yeah, that's what I've been buying recently.
And I guess I'm like, I think that that's the only thing that you can do. But you have to do it because otherwise you're just living in this world where things are happening to you. And it's like, in some small way, at least we can be more careful about it.
Yeah? All right. So, more testing.
More testing.
And I don't know. I think my idea is the best, though. Just rename the chemicals with something that makes sense.
Ball Smasher 1, Ball Smasher 2.
Let people make their choices based on the chemical names at that point.
I think you're
It's
right.
cheaper than testing if you think about it.
That's probably true, but you do have to test them first.
Rest my case.
What are we going to talk about next time? You have a presentation for next time.
Half-baked. We'll get to it. But yeah, I want to follow up with the swindlings versus the unintentional excitement for your results in advance of receiving your theory or your results.
So like committing to the outcomes that you have foretold in science as like a whole, as like part of the enterprise of science.
Oh, I mean, last time we talked when we did a solo conversation, we were looking at the telepathy tapes, and that conversation came not only out of listening to the telepathy tapes when we were on this road trip, but also we were just having this conversation about how much of even academic science or people trying to push their fringe idea, it doesn't really matter. Across the board, people are often really, really excited to believe in some phenomenon before they set out to find out even whether it's a thing. That's how I kind of advanced the last conversation, being like, look, I think a lot of the things we call experiments and papers are demonstrations of a principle that we already knew before we performed said experiments. They're more refinements or demonstrations of a principle that we already understood to be the case. Like, in many cases, that's all right. But in some cases, people, like in the case of Kai Dickens and the telepathy tapes, seems to really, or like Fox Mulder in the X-Files, really, really wants to believe that this phenomenon is occurring and goes and looks for cases that continue to reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. And I think that happens in academic science. I think it happens in fringe science. I think it happens in everyday life all the time. And so it's like, even with this stuff, if you are really, really, for whatever reason, convinced that the feminizing of the masculine world in the West is due to something in the water or in the food supply, then it's pretty easy to find studies that support that idea. But we still don't know for sure.
More research to be done, but but you can never know for sure, I think, is the bottom line. And so this is why I like the people who did Plastic List, who I've been trying to get a couple of them on, and they're in the works. But I'm like, they're very careful about this. They're like, this is not a final analysis of the situation. Like, do not mistake that for being the case. And so I look forward to talking about it. You got something cooking.